Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the CDI Talks. My name is Anton Shekhovtsov and I'm director of the Centre for Democratic Integrity, a non-for-profit Austria-based organization monitoring and analyzing attempts of authoritarian regimes to influence politics and societies in Europe. Our guest today is Roland Freudenstein, policy director of the Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies, the official think tank of the European People's Party. Previously, Roland worked for the German Council on Foreign Relations, the European Commission, and he was also director of the Warsaw office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Good day, Roland, and thank you very much for joining me today.
Good afternoon, Anton.
Roland, my first question is about your thoughts on the Biden-Putin summit. Do we have a clear winner or winners after the summit? And a related question, was it the summit between Washington and Moscow only, or did Washington somehow represent European capitals too?
Well, it certainly represented the whole West because Biden made a point of meeting first with the friends and allies of the United States in several formats, from the G7 to NATO to the European Union. And then he met with the Russian president. So he talks to his allies first, and he made it clear on the way in the lead up to the Geneva summit with Putin that he wants to convey a message not only for the US, but for the whole of the West. And, about winners and losers, let me just say this. This was the best summit between an American and a Russian president since Putin is in power. There was no looking deep into the other's eyes. There was no reset. There was no aping of the rhetoric of Putin that we had, for example, by Trump on Montenegro and World War III. There was no disavowing the US intelligence community that we also had by Trump on the election interference. There was a clear message that, look, we are in a systemic confrontation with Russia, but we need to cooperate on a few things, and clearly showing red lines such as cyber attacks on critical infrastructure and so on. So, having said all this, I must say it was a good summit. The fact that Mr. Putin felt like a winner afterwards should not distract us from the fact that this was a good summit for the West.
Well, at the same time, you see that there were some developments in the run-up to this summit, or maybe they actually triggered that summit. That was the military buildup on Ukraine's border. Does it mean that every time that Russia wants to talk to the West, it needs to somehow start bullying Ukraine? And was it rewarded for this?
No, I don't see this causality. You see, the buildup ended, according to what I know, after a pretty clear phone call by President Biden to President Putin, telling him to get the heck out of there, so to speak, and that's when the buildup ended. America has made it abundantly clear that the military cooperation with Ukraine continues and is even extended. What is also important is that the summit did not take place because of something Russia did. The summit took place because Biden believes in personal meetings. This is debatable. Whether personal meetings make such a difference is indeed debatable. And I would personally have said he could have sent messages and signals in different ways than in a personal summit. But Biden is old school about this. He believes that you can only properly communicate in a meeting that lasts several hours, which is person to person between leaders. And that was the reason they met, and not the Russian buildup in Ukraine.
What about Europe? You seem to agree that Biden somehow represented also European leaders at this summit. But still, when he was talking to the press, for example, he said that he was mainly defending American interests and interests of the American people. And also when he was talking about the cyber attacks, that was the cyber attacks on the critical American infrastructure. What takeaways can Europe have from this summit? Oh.
I don't think Biden made such a strong distinction between American interests and European interests. I mean, what he has to do for a domestic audience is clearly demonstrate with everything he does that he's fighting for American interests. I mean, if you want, this is a consequence of the last 5 years of US domestic politics, where every president in future will have to prove that what they're doing is not for others, but for the American people. But that the particular aspect that Biden is bringing in here is that he is not making a difference between what is good for Europe is good for America. He says that what helps the United States will also help the allies. And in fact, you know, even if he didn't mention cyber attacks on allied institutions and infrastructure, I'm sure that he certainly meant that. And I mean, all his assurances about Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, it all points in this direction. And he has given these assurances multiple times since his inauguration.
The EU joint communication on EU-Russia relations, published on the 16th of June this year, promotes 3 elements: push back, constrain, and engage. Do you see this new communication as a replacement of the 5 guiding principles of the EU-Russia policy adopted several years ago?
I'm afraid not. The EU is sticking to the 5 principles. You know, which date from 2016. And I think, of course, like everything that is adopted by 27 member states, it is a compromise. It is interpretable, of course. And yet, I believe that elements such as the cooperation with civil society and with Russian Democrats should be much higher on the agenda. And frankly speaking, I don't think the continuation of the Minsk process will lead us anywhere, which is the number 1 of the 5 principles. So I'm not saying to officially drop it or anything, but I certainly would downgrade it. So in that sense, you know, the 5 principles, I think, do not suit the situation in 2021. That means 5 years after they were originally adapted, because the global situation has evolved. Russia has become much more aggressive, and at the same time, the Kremlin has become much more aggressive, and at the same time has a new ally in China, which all of these things were not around to that extent in 2016. So I would very much be in favor of a reformulation of the EU strategy vis-a-vis Russia. But if the 5 principles is all we have, and we can at least perform incremental change through reinterpreting elements of the 5 principles, then that's okay with me.
In what crucial areas do you think can EU's policies towards Russia be improved? Some crucial areas. What are there for you?
Look, I think we still haven't gotten ourselves to recognize that democracy needs to be the central element of everything we do vis-a-vis Russia. China too, by the way. And you know, if you say we put democracy at the heart of our Russia, China, and authoritarianism strategy, then that starts at home. It starts with defending our democracies from the intensifying attacks by authoritarian powers. And in Russia's case, obviously, this refers to the Kremlin's Trojan horses. It refers to, you know, much better monitoring money flows. We should have a central register for corruption, for political strategic corruption in Europe. We of course need to constantly work on cyber defense and counter disinformation. But it all stands and falls with civil society, with political parties, with think tanks and networks of individuals. I mean, look at what Bellingcat has done to counter Kremlin narratives. Look at what StopFake has done in Ukraine. This is for me the proof that governments will never be the sole defenders of our democracies, and maybe not even the most important defenders. I think most important defenders of our democracy will come from civil society, and they need the support and the cooperation and sometimes the coordination of governments. Okay, so this is defense, right? Defense of our democracy, and plus, of course, military deterrence, increasing military expenditure, all that. And then comes, for me, the next stage would be to focus on the eastern neighborhood of the European Union. You take the case of Belarus, it is completely clear that not only by now is Lukashenko dependent on Putin, but Putin also depends on Lukashenko. If Lukashenko falls, even if he's replaced by a so-called modernizing apparatchik, right? Even that will be read not only by Belarusians and by other neighboring nations, but also by Russian citizens as an entry gate for a democracy movement. And that is why Putin is not replacing Lukashenko. He could have done so long ago. In fact, if you look at what pundits were predicting, since August 2020, they were predicting that Putin would replace Lukashenko with someone more modern and more dynamic and so on, but keeping the same system. It hasn't happened because even such a replacement would be read as a signal of weakness by the weakness of the Kremlin. So, supporting Democrats and democratic movements, including expats and exile people, of course, is a decisive thing also of our Russia strategy. And then we come to Democrats in Russia itself. Absolutely, as far as it is still possible, support Russian civil society. And they really have to develop interesting business models. The Navalny organization is still around. They are under heavy attacks. Hundreds of their people are arrested, and yet they continue to operate somehow. And of course, that needs innovative support from the side of the European Union. And finally, Russia will not be a dictatorship forever. There is no God-given law of nature that says Russians want to live in a dictatorship. This is just wrong. So we need to see Russia as a future democracy. And this may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, it may take 15 years. But at some point, Russia will be in a better state than it is today concerning its domestic composition, in terms of accountability of government, in terms of its relation with the neighborhood, and in terms of its relations with the West. And we should mentally prepare for that moment and actually define criteria, because when that moment arrives, Russia will not fulfill these slots all at the same time, right? There will be time lags, and that will be a very, very difficult situation for policymakers in the West, and we better think about that moment. But the most important thing for the moment, of course, is the defense of our democracies against the attack that is coming from the Kremlin. And then the support of Democrats in the neighborhood, the support of Democrats in Russia.
And at the same time, if you look at the state of democracy in the EU itself, it may look like the EU has actually strengthened democracy also at home, and not only from the external attacks, but from the internal attacks.
Yeah, well, and these are two sides of the same coin, we cannot possibly export stability through good governance and through the rule of law to the neighborhood if we don't enforce it in the EU itself. And by enforcing, I don't mean sending the stormtroops from the Berlaymont building to Budapest, right? I'm talking about making it expensive to consistently violate fundamental rules. And there is a price to be paid. We're beginning to develop these instruments now with the rule of law conditionality on funds, on the recovery fund and the other instruments of economic solidarity of the European Union. And this is a dire necessity in order to fight authoritarianism inside as well as outside the European Union, because we're really talking about the same thing here.
There is, I think, another aspect to the problem of enforcing democracy, and this is when we're talking about strengthening democracy in the EU, but also Russia. We also find that some people, especially some financial circles, would say, "Well, we are not interested in political values. We're interested in making money." And we all know the prime example, Nord Stream 2, that is still pushed by Germany, that is still pushed by, well, Russian lobbies, but also German lobbies. So they would say, well, we are interested in money. How do we talk to these people? Because they have power. It's not the ultimate political power, but how do we talk to them?
Totally. Something is changing, which in this business community, which we haven't sufficiently noticed. You can take the statement of the head of the German Federation of Industries of yesterday, where he clearly spoke of a global conflict between authoritarianism and democracy. This is a new language. We've seen this kind of language from Joe Biden. We've seen it in the CDU, the latest CDU document, the Wahlprogramm, the election platform. It starts with foreign policy, and the foreign policy part starts with the statement, the overriding conflict of our time is democracy versus authoritarianism. And I tell you, there are business people, even in Germany, believe it or not, who have understood this. I mean, remember the strategy paper on China, which the German Federation of Industries published 2 months before, in 2019, the EU Commission came out with this famous compartmentalization. China is a strategic partner in some areas. It is a competitor in other areas, and it is a systemic rival. This was basically just replicating something that the German Federation of Industries had said 2 months before. So Nord Stream 2, I absolutely concede that it's the biggest geopolitical blunder by German politics in the decade, right? It is absolutely destructive. It should never have found the support of the government. And without the support of the German government, we would have had US sanctions much earlier against the companies, and the companies would have withdrawn, So this is absolutely clear. Now, it has become something of a bone of contention between parts of the German elite and the old and the new US administration. And when Joe Biden waived the sanctions for 90 days, right? This is coming up for renewal every 90 days, the sanctions waiver. So when he did so for 90 days, this was not caving into Putin. This was, if you want to phrase it like this, caving into Merkel, right? Because Merkel, for a reason that I, frankly speaking, do not understand, couldn't bring herself to distance herself from this project. I think she could have politically afforded to do so. The coalition would not have collapsed, because to make a coalition collapse 6 months before the election is nonsense. It wouldn't have changed a thing. So the SPD would have walked out of the government. The CDU could have placed ministers in that place, and would still have to, okay, anyway, it would have worked out. So so I find this unacceptable from Merkel. But there it is. This is the fact. I think the part of the German business community still believes in this kind of appeasement, that, first of all, politics should not be mixed with economics. The rhetoric that, if we started putting these human rights standards into every business relationship we have with people across the world, we could forget about 2/3 of our business relations with other countries, because in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, these are not democracies, most of them. Well, nonsense. These are at least, even Saudi Arabia is not attacking. They're not attacking our hospitals with cyber attacks. They're not they're not spreading blatant lies to disturb our vaccination efforts, and so on and so on. So this is just, this rhetoric is nonsense. And what makes me optimistic is that I see at least sizable parts of the business community in Europe, and especially in Germany, waking up to the fact that you cannot separate politics from business. And also that, neither Russia nor China are playing in any way fair when it comes to business. China is using the openness of our society also for economic advantage. Russia is using the openness of our society for strategic corruption, through projects like Nord Stream 2. So in other words, I can see the enlightened part of the business community actually understanding that they need to revise some things, and it is happening before our very eyes.
Speaking of China, we already mentioned it several times. I think we are now finally witnessing an emerging consensus in Europe that Chinese Communist Party is posing an existential threat to the EU. How would you describe the very nature of the conflict between the EU and China?
Well, now extrapolating or actually developing from this famous triple subdivision of compartmentalization of relations with China of the European Commission, I would say that the West and China are systemic rivals who nevertheless have to cooperate on some areas. So one is the noun, the other one is a verb, and that makes all the difference, right? The noun signifies what we are. The verb signifies what we do. What we are, we cannot change. What we do, we can influence. And this is missing in the Commission ideology of like, today we're partners, tomorrow competitors, and on Wednesday we can be systemic rivals. To me, that doesn't cut the ice. There is an overarching reality, which is systemic rivalry. And we didn't start the fire, as the song goes. We talk about systemic rivalry. China got really, really worked up about this, as if the so-called document number 9 had never existed. Now, document number 9 sounds a bit ominous, like a conspiracy theory, but it's a freely accessible document, also translated into English, from 2013, in which the Chinese Communist Party very, very clearly, in absolutely clear words, condemns all Western influence, condemns the idea of the rule of law, of truly free elections, of pluralism and freedom of opinion. I mean, all this is considered an existential threat to the political system of the People's Republic of China. This is 2013, when we were still dreaming of Wandel durch Handel, right? Change through trade. And we were dreaming of by closer relations, also kind of helping China to democratize itself. I mean, we should have read documents like this with a little bit more alertness. But today, for China to say that the West is being confrontational is a complete lie.
Where in Europe do you see the most worrying examples of malign Chinese influence?
I see it in countries and parts of countries or sectors of societies where China has decisive economic and financial influence. I mean, this reaches from countries like Greece. They own part of the port of Athens, Piraeus, and after they had bought it, the Greek government, and this goes for all Greek governments since then, vetoed a resolution about territorial expansion in the South China Sea and so on. What is even more ominous is the mixture of financial influence and political admiration by some European leaders. And who I'm referring to here, Mr. Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, who is trying to establish a huge campus for the originally Shanghai-based Fudan University in the middle of Budapest, and at fantastically positive conditions, and probably at the cost of a lot of advantages for Hungarian students and Hungarian universities. And this meets with a lot of resentment in Hungary, and correctly so. So I think that this may ultimately be a miscalculation with Hungarian public opinion. But in any case, these are examples of how China influences already our democracies. It is with the help of elites, elite capture. China buys media. China has established Confucius Institutes in hundreds of places across the world, and many of them in Europe. These Confucius Institutes then, through financial influence again, for example, make it impossible for the universities in which they are based to hold discussion events on topics like Taiwan, like Tibet, like Xinjiang, or Hong Kong. All these are topics that will never be co-financed by anything in which the Confucius Institutes have any influence. So, I mean, these are just tiny examples. There's much, much more. There are so many front organizations for the Communist Party in Chinese academia, in the think tank world, and of course, enterprises too. Take Huawei. Any Chinese company operating in other countries is committed to cooperate with Chinese intelligence. All this is accessible black and white. So I see a serious threat to our liberal democracy by China.
In one of your most recent pieces, you write that China wants to shape the world in its image. But while it may be true for many other countries, it may be problematic for Western liberal democracies to adopt, for example, one-party rule or state capitalism, which are, the opposite of Western, I would say, soul even. Or do you feel that it may change in the future?
I hope not. I mean, for millions of people in the West to actually advocate one-party rule, a lot would have to change, right? I mean, I think without a massive brainwash, it wouldn't work. So I think we do stand a fighting chance in this. And frankly speaking, even in countries like Africa, in regions like Africa and many parts of Asia, people don't want one-party rule. They do appreciate some more freedom. They may believe that it's possible to create a modus vivendi and profit from Chinese capital without having to buy into the ideology. But that becomes harder and harder because, China used to declare they're not interested in political systems. They used to tell us that, we think your democracy is nonsense, but go on, have it. It's no problem with us. This is not the China of today. This is not the China of Xi Jinping, because the China of Xi Jinping has so far developed interests in almost every part of the globe that in every country across the globe, there is a pro-Chinese and an anti-Chinese faction in their eyes. So in other words, they start to distinguish between things that are profitable and useful for the Chinese Communist Party and things that seem to be obstacles. And there you go. At that moment, China will start to influence events in your democracy. And that is something that we cannot accept. I see public opinion generally swinging against the Chinese Communist Party. Especially in Western countries. I know it's different in other places, but then again, I mean, take a country like India and look how, for example, in social media, the whole Indian public opinion, the cutting edge of Indian society, is now dead set against the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, that wasn't even 5 years ago, that wasn't like this. So this is really something new. And these are, for me, signs of hope that China will not manage to create the world in its image.
It seems to me that with Russia, for example, there is a human dimension that you are proposing, talking to Russian Democrats, talking to the Russian civil society, strengthening Russian civil society. Is something like this possible in our dealing with China? Can we talk to the Chinese civil society, or is it off the limits?
As long as we have some kind of business and business relationship and tourism, it will be possible to communicate to the average Chinese. And I, again, like in Russia's case, refuse to buy the notion that Chinese are somehow genetically incapable of building and living in a democracy. And I think that Hong Kong until now and Taiwan are the best examples that the notion of some kind of incompatibility between Chinese culture and democracy is complete nonsense. This is actually a myth that the Chinese Communist Party wants to make us believe, right? That's why they talk about Asian values. That's why they talk about any kind of democracy activity being anti-Chinese or un-Chinese. I mean, these are their narratives which are supposed to safeguard the power of the Communist Party. So we shouldn't buy that, and we should really creatively develop ways to communicate with the average Chinese. And of course, in the current situation, after 20 years of very, very substantial economic growth, which is, resulting in a new Chinese middle class, of course, Chinese are not in a revolutionary mood. I can understand this. But this growth will impossibly be maintained in that intensity. So you will see signs of dissatisfaction in China very soon. For that moment, we should have something to offer to Chinese who believe that they might want to think about a different political system.
Should the EU try to decouple China and Putin's Russia?
As Mahatma Gandhi said when he was asked, what do you think about Western democracy? He said, I think it would be a good idea. So yes, it would be a good idea to decouple China and Russia, but I just don't see any possibility. And the point is that to pry Russia away from China, which is a popular idea with people in the West, up to President Macron, who quite openly talked about it. It would imply a cost. You would have to give Putin something. Well, what do you want to give Putin? I don't see anything of substance that the West can give him, for example, in terms of allowing him to invade his neighboring countries without any repercussion. None of this is worth somehow getting some kind of division between Russia and China. So I don't see the possibility right now. The fact is that the Kremlin and the Chinese Communist Party have identified the West as their existential common enemy. Both of them think that the very existence of the West is a danger to their power structure. And this will remain for a long time to come. So we need to live with this reality. And the answer, of course, is that the West should build alliances to many, many other countries across the globe. And, some of them may not even be Westminster democracies, but they will be neighbors of China that are unhappy with China's imperialism. And of course, we can talk to them and cooperate with them. Doesn't mean that they have to become members of the Club of Democracies. But we can very well contribute, cooperate with them, exchange intelligence, and so on. The most important thing is that we need a global community of countries that will represent a counterweight against the Russian-Chinese authoritarian alliance.
When you're talking about China and Putin's Russia, you still seem to be optimistic. You see, you still see that something is possible and a different future with dealing with these countries is possible. But when we're talking about political values, when we're talking about human rights, rule of law, we are also seemingly we deal with these countries, China and Russia, from the ideological point of view. Is this the return of ideology? Because sometimes you look at the European publics, you listen to some European politicians, and you still see that there is much cynicism in those statements. But are you witnessing a return of ideology despite all of this?
Certainly, our international relations and also debates inside free societies have become more political and more ideological and more polarized. I mean, that is clearly an effect of social media. You could also say maybe some economic inequalities that have increased since the global financial crisis. That is probably a factor as well. We have identity politics. We have the woke left, which is becoming illiberal itself, right? This is another factor. I don't think it's the driving factor. I don't think it's the most important one, but it is a factor that makes it easier for authoritarian voices inside our own system, especially, but also Russia and China, to argue that Western democracy is not really democratic if people in universities lose their jobs because they use the wrong word for a black person or whatever, So there's a lot of factors here why things have become more ideological and more polarized. And then, yes, there is a general doubt in the validity and the long-term viability of liberal democracy. This goes back to actually 2 decades ago. There's a famous interview in the BBC by Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian, arguably the most famous Slovenian except for Melania Trump. So Slavoj Žižek says, look, the idea of the West has died in 2 instances in the first decade of the 21st century. The belief in global democracy died with 9/11 in 2001, and the belief in global capitalism died with the financial crisis in 2008. While I don't think that capitalism or democracy are dead, and I think, the last 12 years have certainly proven that they aren't, I do think that there is something to these 2 instances, and that in this first decade of the 21st century, something did happen. Partly also because we were so over-optimistic in the 1990s. After the fall of the wall, a lot of people around the world, and not only in the West, but also outside the classical West, started believing that indeed we have seen the end of history in some way, and that liberal democracy will rule the globe at some point. It might take a little bit longer in some places, but that eventually all dictatorships and all other ideologies would fall. Well, this has not happened, but that doesn't mean that so far I see any viable alternative to liberal democracy in terms of creating the highest the highest good for the highest number. I still believe liberal democracy is this system with local variants, of course, but it will take immeasurably longer than we optimistically believed in the 1990s. So the backsliding that has happened in the first decade of the 20th century, and which is actually there is still some backsliding today. If you look at the right-wing extremism and populism, which is which has really grown only since the migration crisis in 2015. Then Trump and Brexit and so on. I mean, these are big chunks of backsliding that are still happening. But we've been at this point before. Remember? No, you don't remember. I don't remember. But from history books, we know the 1930s were a time when the West seemed to be finished. Right? The capitalism had caused World War I. The Western democracies looked old and tired. And these collectivist movements that were marching through the streets, and some of them with red flags, others with swastikas, but they had one big thing in common. They believed in the collective. They believed that there is one party which knows what the people want, and that these bickering democracies with their multi-party systems are completely incapable of delivering to the people. And more people started believing that. And what I find most shameful is more and more intellectuals started believing that in the 1930s, And then, from 1945 onwards, liberal democracy made a smashing comeback. And for the next 40, 50 years, liberal democracy was the thing. So, we should not let ourselves be sidetracked by the crisis that liberal democracy is evidently in right now. I think we should remember that we've been at this point before, and that just these collectivist systems are not the future.
And on this optimistic note, Roland, I want very much to thank you for this insightful conversation. And I want to wish you all the best, and also to your think tank, which is, given the prominence of the European People's Party in Europe, is a very important organization. I also want to thank our audience and remind you that you may want to subscribe to our channel to receive notifications when we upload new episodes of the CDI Talks. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.